Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
Mile marker 12. I want to say up front that I've heard a lot of strange things come through a headset. 7 years working night shift as a communications operator for a rural county sheriff's department will do that to you. Domestic disputes, wrecks, wellness checks on people who turn out to be fine and people who turn out not to be. I got good at hearing the difference between real fear and performed fear in a caller's voice. Good at staying calm while someone screamed at me. Good at doing my job. And I built a version of myself around that steadiness that I was, and still am, genuinely proud of. I'm telling you all of that first because I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe isn't a new dispatcher's nerves, or somebody who didn't know what real emergencies sounded like. I knew exactly what I was hearing. I just couldn't explain it, and eventually I stopped trying to. I've told pieces of this to a small handful of people since. A partner who stopped asking, eventually, why I still flinch at a block number on my own phone. A coworker at my current job who caught me mid-thought once and never brought it up again after seeing my face. But I've never told the whole thing straight through, start to finish, in order. I'm doing that now because enough time has passed that I think I can get through it. And because I think, after everything, it deserves to exist somewhere outside my own head, told the way I actually lived it rather than the careful, shortened version I've given the handful of people who've ever asked me directly what really happened out there. County Central Dispatch covers a rural stretch of highway and back roads spread across roughly 900 square miles, most of it farmland and forest, with a scattered handful of small towns that between them don't add up to 30,000 people, spread thin enough that most residents knew their nearest neighbor by name and their nearest hospital by a drive time measured in the better part of an hour. I took the overnight shift, 11 at night to 7 in the morning, mostly because it paid a shift differential and suited a version of myself that's always worked better alone in a quiet room than surrounded by people during the day. I sat in a windowless communications room with 3 other console positions, usually staffed by just me and one other operator overnight, headset on, for monitors in front of me showing CAD mapping, caller ID, unit locations, and call history. It's a strange kind of intimacy, dispatch work. You spend a career listening to the worst moment of a stranger's life through a thin piece of plastic against your ear, and you never see their face, and they never see yours, and somehow that's exactly what lets you help them. I should say something about why a person takes a job like that in the first place, because it matters for understanding how long I stayed, even after things turned strange. There's a specific satisfaction to being the calm, steady voice on the other end of the worst night of someone's life, to knowing that the sound of your own voice, level and unhurried, can genuinely change the outcome of an emergency in progress. I built a real professional identity around that over 7 years, the same way anyone does around work they're quietly proud of, and I think that's part of why I let myself stay as long as I did. A person who's found the specific version of usefulness that finally fits doesn't want to be the kind of person who walks away from it over something they can't fully explain. I trained under a dispatcher named Marcus Webb, a calm, unshakable man in his 50s who'd worked that console for over 20 years by the time I started, who could talk a panicking caller through CPR instructions in the same, even tone he used to order lunch. He became, over my 7 years there, close to the only person who fully understood what this job actually costs a person, and close to the only person I ever fully trusted with what eventually happened. I also came to know Deputy Roy Hollis, a patrol deputy who'd worked that same rural district for nearly 15 years and who I talked to almost every overnight shift, since dispatch and patrol build a particular kind of relationship over enough long, quiet nights together. You learn a deputy's voice on the radio the way you'd learn a coworker's footsteps in a hallway. And you know within half a sentence when something in their tone is genuinely wrong. and I came to know Mrs. Agatha Pruitt, a volunteer with the County Historical Society in her 70s, who I met entirely by accident partway through this, and who ended up knowing more about what was happening than anyone else alive. The daily rhythm of that job is worth describing, because it matters later how completely routine it had become to me by the time anything strange started. Most overnight shifts were quiet stretches punctuated by short bursts of real work, a drunk driving complaint, a barking dog call, occasionally something genuinely serious. I learned the county's geography by call volume the way you learn a city by its neighborhoods, which stretches of highway generated the most wrecks, which houses called in domestic disputes on a predictable monthly rhythm, which roads flooded first in heavy rain. I built an entire mental map of that county out of nothing but voices and coordinates over the first 2 years, and I want that on record, because it's exactly that familiarity that made the first anomaly stand out at all. Year 1. My first year, I noticed one thing that I filed away without much thought, the way you file away most oddities in your first year at any new job. Roughly every 6 to 8 weeks, always overnight, always the graveyard hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, a call would come in reporting a multi-vehicle accident at mile marker 12 on County Road 9, a rural two-lane stretch with a sharp blind curve locals had always called simply the Bend. I'd dispatch units, same as any other accident call, and the responding deputy would arrive to find nothing. No wreck, no debris, no skid marks, nothing at all consistent with a call describing what more than one caller, over time, described in strikingly similar language. Multiple vehicles, people trapped, someone screaming. I chalked the pattern up, my first year, to a bad cell tower near that stretch of road generating phantom pings, or a prank caller with an unusual amount of persistence, and mentioned it to nobody beyond the ordinary shift change notes. Marcus trained me my first 6 weeks on that console, sitting beside me at a shared headset jack, correcting my radio protocol, teaching me how to keep my voice level when a caller's wasn't. I remember him telling me, early on, that the hardest part of the job wasn't the calls themselves, but the quiet stretches between them, the hours where nothing happened and your mind was free to wander toward whatever it wanted to wander toward, and that a good dispatcher learned to fill that quiet with something productive rather than letting it fill itself with dread. I didn't understand, at the time, how specifically that advice would end up applying to me. I remember one of those first-year calls specifically, mostly because of how ordinary and unremarkable it felt to me at the time, a call I logged and moved past without a second thought. A male voice, older, reported the accident in a flat, almost bored tone, gave a location, and hung up before I could ask a single follow-up question, the kind of terse, businesslike call you get sometimes from someone who witnesses something briefly from a passing car and doesn't want to get further involved. I noted it as exactly that in my log and thought nothing more of it until, years later, going back through old records for an entirely different reason, I found that the exact same flat, terse phrasing, nearly word for word, had been used in at least 4 other mile marker 12 calls spanning more than a decade, logged by different dispatchers who'd worked that console long before I ever started, none of whom, as far as I could ever determine, had ever compared notes with each other. Year 2. My second year, I started actually looking at the caller ID data for those calls rather than simply dispatching and moving on, and that's when the pattern stopped fitting any explanation I could hold on to comfortably. Several of those mile marker 12 calls traced back to phone numbers that our system flagged as disconnected, not currently disconnected, but disconnected for years, some going back over a decade, landlines belonging to addresses that had since been torn down or families that had since moved away. I brought this up with our IT contractor, who told me, plausibly enough, that old rural phone infrastructure sometimes retained ghost entries in regional carrier databases, and that a disconnected number occasionally getting misrouted through outdated switching equipment wasn't unheard of in a county with as much aging telecom infrastructure as ours. I believe that, mostly, the way you believe an explanation that lets you keep doing your job without dwelling on it. There was a second thing from that second year, smaller, that I only connected to the rest of it much later. Our console equipment included an old analog radio scanner, decommissioned years before I started, but never physically removed from the room, sitting dark and unplugged on a shelf behind the main console as a kind of accidental relic. Twice that year, arriving for my shift, I found its power light on and a faint static hiss coming from its speaker, despite it having no power cable connected to anything at all. Both times I unplugged nothing, because there was nothing plugged in to unplug. I mentioned it to Marcus, who told me old equipment sometimes held a residual charge in its internal capacitors for years after being decommissioned, capable of powering an indicator light and a weak signal for a short time under the right conditions. I accepted that explanation at the time. I've thought about it considerably since. There was a third instance, over a year later, that I never mentioned to Marcus at all. I was alone in the room on a slow overnight, and the scanner's static shifted, briefly, into something almost like a voice, garbled and distant beneath the hiss, there and gone in under 2 seconds before the static resumed, as if nothing had happened. I sat looking at that dead, unplugged radio for a long time afterward, and I never did figure out a version of the capacitor explanation that accounted for a decommissioned, disconnected speaker producing anything that structured, however briefly. I mentioned the scanner to Priya Nair, the other overnight operator who shared that room with me 2 or 3 nights a week, mostly as an odd piece of shift change small talk. She told me, more seriously than I expected, that she'd noticed the same thing herself at least once, months before I'd ever brought it up, and had said nothing about it because she'd assumed, the same way I initially had, that it wasn't worth mentioning. She told me something else that night that I hadn't known, that in her second year on the console, before I'd started, she'd taken a mile marker 12 call herself, and that the caller had gone quiet partway through, then asked her, in a voice she described as sounding suddenly much older than it had a moment before, whether she believed the person on the other end of the line was really there. She said she'd hung up the call entirely, against every piece of her own training, the only time in her career she'd ever done that, and had never told anyone in an official capacity why. Year 3. My third year passed with the pattern continuing at roughly the same frequency, 6 to 8 weeks between calls, always the same location, always the same overnight hours, and it was that year I started keeping my own informal log of them, separate from the official CAD system, dates and times, and exactly what each caller had said. Though I couldn't have told you at the time why I felt the need to keep a private record of something I'd already been told had a mundane technical explanation. I kept that notebook in my own bag, never in the dispatch room itself, and I never once told Marcus about it until years later, though I suspect, looking back, that he'd have understood immediately if I had. That same year, cross-referencing the dates in my private log against our staffing schedule out of pure curiosity, I noticed something I hadn't expected. Every single mile marker 12 call in 3 years of data had occurred during a shift when I was the primary operator on console, rather than any other overnight dispatcher, despite the schedule rotating fairly evenly between 3 of us across that period. I sat with that pattern a long time before deciding it was almost certainly simple probability doing something that only felt significant because I was the one looking for significance, since I worked more overnight shifts overall than either of my rotating colleagues by a modest margin. It was the kind of explanation that works perfectly well right up until the sample size grows too large to keep leaning on it, and I didn't yet know, that year, how large the sample would eventually get. I believed that explanation for exactly as long as it took the pattern to hold, unbroken, for 3 more years after that. I ran the numbers properly. Eventually, years later, Once I understood enough statistics to do it right rather than just eyeballing a spreadsheet. Actual probability, accounting honestly for my slightly higher share of overnight coverage. The odds of every single mile marker 12 call over 6 straight years landing on my shifts by chance alone came out low enough that I stopped being able to call it coincidence with a straight face, even to myself, even years after I'd left that job behind for good. Year 4. It was in my 4th year that things stopped being explainable at all. I took one of the mile marker 12 calls myself that year, directly, rather than reviewing it after the fact the way I usually did on nights. I wasn't the one who'd answered. It came in at 2:47 in the morning, caller ID showing a landline number, and when I answered, a young woman's voice, genuinely frightened, told me there'd been a terrible accident, that there were people trapped, that someone needed to come right now. I asked her name. She told me it was Dana. I asked her to stay on the line while I dispatched units, standard protocol, and she did, her breathing audible. Occasional sounds in the background I logged at the time as consistent with a real roadside scene. Distant engine noise, what might have been someone else's voice further away, calling out something I couldn't make out clearly enough to log. At one point she said, quietly, almost to herself rather than to me, I told her we should have taken the other road. A detail I wrote down verbatim at the time because it felt so specific, so genuinely lived in, that I never once doubted in the moment I was talking to a real, frightened teenager at a real accident scene. The call lasted just under 6 minutes before it cut off abruptly, mid-sentence, the way a dropped call does rather than the way someone hanging up on purpose does. Deputy Hollis responded to that call. He found nothing at mile marker 12. No vehicles, no debris, nothing, the same as every other time. But this time, when he ran the caller's landline number through the system back at his cruiser laptop, it came back registered to a residence that had burned down in a house fire 11 years earlier, a fire that had killed one occupant, a 17-year-old girl named Dana Ferris. I didn't sleep well after that shift. I told myself, initially, that it had to be a coincidence of names, or a prank caller who'd somehow known enough county history to reference a real tragedy convincingly. I looked up Dana Ferris's case file the next evening before my shift started, official county records, nothing hidden or difficult to access, and found that she had, in fact, died in that house fire 11 years earlier, but also found something the fire report hadn't mentioned and that I only found by following a citation to an older file. 2 years before the fire, at age 15, Dana Ferris had survived a car accident on County Road 9. At mile marker 12. The same blind curve. Her mother had died in that earlier crash. Dana had been the only survivor. The old accident report, handwritten by a responding officer decades before digital records, included a single quoted line from 15-year-old Dana at the scene, given to the investigating officer in the immediate aftermath. I told her we should have taken the other road. I read that line at my kitchen table at 4 in the afternoon, sunlight coming through the window, and felt something go cold in my chest that took a long time to fully leave. I want to be honest that at the time, I filed this under deeply unsettling coincidence involving a real tragedy, and tried to let it go, the way you try to let go of something your job requires you to keep functioning around. I finished that 4th year doing my best not to dwell on it, going through the motions of a job I still, underneath everything, genuinely loved. I finished my 5th year the same way. The calls kept coming at their usual 6 to 8 week interval, and I kept dispatching units to find nothing, and I kept telling myself there was a version of normal I could return to if I just didn't look too closely. Something happened at my own apartment that 5th year that I never told anyone about until Marcus, much later. I woke one morning, on a day I wasn't scheduled to work, to find my personal cell phone, which I always, without exception, left charging on my nightstand overnight, silenced, showing a missed call notification from a blocked number, logged at 3:14 in the morning, the exact overnight hour the mile marker 12 calls always came in, on a night when I hadn't been working the console at all. There was no voicemail. The call had lasted, according to my phone's own log, exactly 6 minutes, the same length as the Dana Ferris call years earlier, though my phone hadn't rung, hadn't lit up, hadn't done anything at all to wake me while it was apparently connected. I checked with my carrier, who confirmed the call in their own records but couldn't explain why my phone had shown no incoming ring or vibration during a call their own system confirmed had actually connected and lasted the full 6 minutes. I didn't sleep in that apartment again without my phone switched fully off for close to a year after that. There was one more thing from that 5th year worth mentioning specifically, though at the time I connected it to nothing beyond a technical annoyance. Our CAD system logs every call's exact duration and timestamp automatically, a record that's supposed to be tamper-proof for legal and evidentiary reasons. Going through the system's call history for an unrelated audit, I found, on 3 separate occasions that year, mile marker 12 calls logged with a start timestamp that preceded the actual 911 trunk line receiving the call by several seconds, meaning, according to our own system's own internal logic, the call had somehow begun being logged before it had technically been placed. I mentioned it to our IT contractor, who said, plausibly enough, that clock drift between different pieces of legacy telecom equipment could occasionally produce timestamp anomalies like that, especially across a system as old and patched together as ours. I believed it, mostly, the way you believe an explanation that lets you keep functioning. I pulled the raw carrier side call detail records for one of those 3 calls myself, months later, out of a need to check the IT contractor's explanation against something outside our own system entirely, a request I had to justify to our records custodian as routine quality assurance, which wasn't exactly a lie. The carrier's own independent log, generated by equipment entirely separate from our county's aging infrastructure, showed the exact same impossible timestamp, the call beginning to register in their network before the physical act of dialing could have occurred by any account of how telephone networks function. I never mentioned that specific detail to the IT contractor. There wasn't an explanation left for him to offer that would have actually helped. I did, eventually, send the raw carrier data to a regional telecom engineer the county occasionally contracted for larger infrastructure questions, framing it, again, as a routine technical curiosity rather than anything more. He got back to me nearly 3 weeks later, longer than any of his previous responses had ever taken, with a 2-line email that read, in full, the timestamp discrepancy is real and consistent with the carrier's own network logs. I don't have an explanation for it that I'm comfortable putting in writing. I read that email more times than I'd like to admit, turning the specific phrasing over in my mind, the careful distance in comfortable putting in writing, doing more work than a longer, more direct answer ever could have. He never responded to my follow-up question, and I never asked the county to contract him again. It was partway through my 6th year, the one that ended the job for me entirely, that I stopped being able to explain any of it away. Partway through that 5th year, I tried, once, to find any surviving family of Dana Ferris, mostly out of a need to know whether anyone else was carrying the same weight I was without my even realizing it. I found, through public records, a maternal aunt still living 2 counties over, and I called her once, identifying myself honestly as a county dispatcher rather than explaining the real reason for my call, which I couldn't have put into words that would have sounded like anything other than what it was. She was polite, briefly, and told me Dana's death was not something she discussed with strangers, however well-intentioned, and asked me not to call again. I never did. I've thought about that phone call more than almost any other single moment in this whole story, because I've never been able to decide whether I owed her an explanation I never gave, or whether leaving her alone was the only genuinely decent thing I did in those 6 years. I finally did what I probably should have done years earlier and drove out to mile marker 12 myself, in full daylight, on an off day, telling myself it was simple curiosity about a stretch of road I'd sent units to more times than I could count without ever having seen it myself. The drive out took nearly 40 minutes from my apartment, mostly flat farmland giving way gradually to denser tree cover as the road climbed toward the ridge where the curve sat, and I remember feeling, the closer I got, a specific tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with the actual, ordinary scenery passing my windows. The bend was exactly what the name suggested, a sharp blind curve on an otherwise straight rural highway, guardrail on the outer edge showing the kind of dented, replaced and repaired history you'd expect from decades of accidents at a genuinely dangerous piece of road engineering. There was nothing supernatural about the location itself in daylight. It looked like exactly what it was, a bad curve that had claimed real lives over real decades for real, boring reasons involving speed and poor sight lines. The kind of place a county road engineer could point to and explain in 5 minutes without needing anything stranger than physics. I stood at the shoulder for close to 20 minutes, longer than the actual task of photographing the marker required, and a local pickup truck slowed as it came through the curve, the driver, an older man I didn't recognize, giving me a long, appraising look through his windshield before continuing on rather than stopping to ask if I needed help, the way most rural drivers would for a stranger standing alone at the roadside. I've wondered since whether that was simple caution about a stopped stranger or something closer to recognition of exactly what kind of person stands at that particular curve for that particular length of time. What I did find, walking the shoulder near the guardrail, was a small, weathered wooden cross, one of dozens of roadside memorials you'd find on any rural highway in the country, except this one had no name on it at all, just a series of tally marks carved into the wood, grouped in clusters of 5, more clusters than I could easily count, the kind of marking a person might use to track something with no calendar to reference. Near the base of the cross, half buried in the dirt and grown over with a season's worth of weeds, I found a second, older marker entirely. Its wood so weathered the carved marks on it were barely legible, clearly predating the newer cross by years if not decades, as though someone had been maintaining this count across multiple physical markers over a very long time. I photographed both, though I never fully explained to myself why, and I didn't touch either one. I showed the photographs to Marcus over dinner that week, half expecting him to have a simple, grounding explanation the way he'd had for the scanner and everything else. He didn't. He looked at the images for a long time in silence, longer than he'd looked at anything I'd shown him before, and told me only that he thought whoever had carved those tally marks had been keeping count of something the rest of us weren't meant to be counting alongside them, and that he'd rather not speculate further than that over dinner. It was the closest Marcus ever came, in all our years working together, to admitting he genuinely didn't have an answer for something in front of him. I mentioned the mile marker 12 pattern to Mrs. Agatha Pruitt not long after that, having been introduced to her through a completely unrelated County Historical Society event Marcus had dragged me to, treating it as idle local history curiosity rather than anything more pointed. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman who spoke slowly and precisely, the way people do when they've spent a lifetime being doubted and have learned to make every word count before anyone can dismiss it. She didn't dismiss it the way I half expected her to. She told me, in fact, that mile marker 12 had a history going back considerably further than Dana Ferris's crash, further than most people currently living in the county knew or remembered. In November of 1962, a county school bus carrying 11 children had gone off the road at that exact curve during a sudden ice storm, killing 4 children and the driver. The county, according to Mrs. Pruitt had quietly settled with the affected families, made vague public commitments to improve the road's safety that were only partially followed through on decades later, and had, in the intervening years, seen a slow but steady string of additional fatal accidents at that same curve, never enough at once to trigger a major infrastructure overhaul. Always just enough to keep the location's reputation alive among longtime locals as a place you drove through carefully and didn't linger near. After dark. Mrs. Pruitt told me one of the surviving children from that bus, a girl who would have been about 7 at the time, had grown up, stayed in the county her whole life, and had, decades later, near the end of her own life, told a hospice volunteer, the same source Mrs. Pruitt had eventually tracked down and spoken to directly, that she still dreamed about that curve several nights a week, every week, for the entire 70 years since, always the same dream, always ending the same way. Someone standing at the center of the road, patiently, as if waiting for the bus to come back around again. There was a second version of that 1962 story, Mrs. Pruitt told me, one she'd only ever heard from a single elderly source, decades before, and had never been able to independently verify in any surviving newspaper record. In that version, the bus driver hadn't lost control of the vehicle by accident at all. He'd swerved deliberately, according to one surviving child's account given to family privately and never repeated to any official investigator, to avoid something standing in the road at the exact center of the curve, something the child had described only once, as a small child does, as a person who wasn't standing right. Mrs. Pruitt said she'd never been able to decide whether that detail was a real, half-remembered piece of a genuine trauma, or a story that had simply grown stranger with each retelling over 60 years the way small-town stories do. She told me she'd stopped trying to decide a long time ago, because both versions, true or not, led to the same curve, and the same road, and the same 6 decades of near misses on ever actually fixing it. About 3 weeks after that conversation, I took a call at 3:14 in the morning that I still have trouble describing fully. Caller ID showed no number at all, a blank field our system had never once produced in my 6 years working that console. A voice, young, unmistakably distressed, said my own name before saying anything else at all, which no legitimate caller had ever done, since callers don't know a dispatcher's name unless it's been given to them mid-call. I remember my hand going still on the mouse, the whole room narrowing down to the headset against my ear, my own trained, professional calm holding on by something closer to muscle memory than actual composure. Then the voice said, simply, "It's happening again. Please send someone." I asked who was calling. There was no answer, only the same background sounds I'd logged years earlier on the Dana Ferris call, distant engine noise, a voice too far away to make out words. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds before cutting off the same abrupt way the others had. I sat in that windowless room afterward for a long moment before I could make myself log the call properly, hands not quite steady on the keyboard. I dispatched Deputy Hollis, more out of procedure than any real expectation at that point, though some part of me already suspected, before he'd even reached the scene, exactly what he would and wouldn't find there. He found nothing at mile marker 12, the same as every time before. When I told him afterward that the caller had said my name, he went quiet in a way I'd never heard from him in years of working together, and told me it was the 3rd time in his career that a caller connected to that stretch of road had done something he couldn't explain to a dispatcher directly. His own memory of a call years earlier where the caller had described, in specific and accurate detail, a physical scar on his own arm that he'd never once mentioned on any radio traffic in his career. He told me the scar was from a car accident of his own, as a teenager, on a different road entirely, decades before he'd ever become a deputy, a detail no county record could possibly have connected to him. He said he'd pulled his sleeve down without thinking, mid-conversation with a dispatcher who couldn't see him at all, the same reflexive gesture he'd apparently made every single time he told this story since. He also told me one more account, secondhand, from a retired deputy who'd told him once, off the record, about a mile marker 12 call where the caller had recited the retired deputy's home address correctly, unprompted, before the line went dead. I decided, finally, to ask Mrs. Pruitt for everything she actually knew, in full, rather than in the fragments she'd given me at a casual community event. She invited me to the small county historical society archive room she volunteered at, boxes of old newspapers and county records stacked floor to ceiling, dust catching the light from a single high window, and told me, once we were alone, that she'd spent decades quietly compiling her own private record of mile marker 12's history specifically because she'd never found anyone in an official capacity willing to take the pattern seriously enough to investigate it properly herself. She showed me her own version of exactly the kind of notebook I'd been keeping myself, thicker and older than mine, dates going back to well before I was born, and I remember the specific, quiet relief of realizing I wasn't the only person who'd ever felt the need to keep a private record of something nobody official would take seriously. I told her, that same visit, about the pattern I'd found linking every call to my own shift specifically, my voice steadier than I actually felt saying it out loud to another person for the first time. She didn't seem surprised by it at all, which unsettled me more than if she had been. She told me she'd noticed something similar in her own decades of research, cross-referencing old dispatcher schedules against newspaper accident reports where she could still find them. The calls, across 60 years, and at least 4 different dispatchers she'd been able to identify by name through old public records, had always seemed to cluster most heavily around whichever operator had, in her words, started listening the closest. The ones who kept their own notes, asked their own questions, drove out to look at the curve themselves. She offered this, she was careful to say, not as an explanation of any mechanism she understood, only as a pattern she thought I should know about before I decided how much further to look. One of those 4 names, she told me, belonged to a dispatcher who'd worked that same console in the 1980s, a woman who had, according to a brief item Mrs. Pruitt had found in old county personnel records, resigned abruptly after just under 7 years on the job, almost exactly the length of time I'd end up working there myself, though Mrs. Pruitt hadn't known that detail about my own tenure yet when she first told me. She'd never been able to track down what became of that earlier dispatcher after she left the county, whether she'd simply moved on the way I eventually would, or whether something else entirely had happened to her. I've thought about that unnamed woman more than I expected to, in the years since. Another person, decades before me, who apparently listened too closely to the same request for too long, and who I will likely never have the chance to ask what she heard. She told me that in her understanding, built from decades of reading old accident reports and talking to families who no longer lived in the county, the road itself hadn't simply claimed an unusually high number of victims through ordinary bad luck. Every serious study the county had ever commissioned on that stretch of highway had recommended straightening the curve or adding modern safety barriers, and every single one of those recommendations had, for reasons buried in decades of county budget records she'd traced herself, quietly failed to get funded, year after year, decade after decade. An unbroken record of near misses on actually fixing the problem that she found, by that point in her life, impossible to attribute to coincidence alone. She said she didn't have a theory that explained the calls themselves. She'd never personally heard one, and wasn't a dispatcher, but she told me, in the same flat, practical tone I now recognized from everyone who'd ever given me a real warning about something like this, that if a caller from that stretch of road ever asked me directly to come out there myself, I should not go. I spent part of my next scheduled day off at the county records office, telling myself I wanted to verify the funding history misses. Pruitt had described for my own peace of mind. The clerk pulled the relevant budget files for me without much comment until I specified the exact road project, at which point she paused, looked at me a beat longer than the request seemed to warrant, and told me, in the careful, neutral tone of someone who has learned exactly how much to say to strangers, that the mile marker 12 safety project's records were thinner than most across several administrations, and that I shouldn't be surprised if I didn't find a clean paper trail explaining why. I also found, in the newspaper archive at the public library, brief coverage from 3 separate decades, 1971, 1989, and 2003, each one reporting a fatal accident at mile marker 12, each one including a nearly identical closing line from the county commissioner quoted at the time, promising the road would finally be addressed in the coming budget cycle. None of the 3 commissioners were the same person. None of the 3 promises were ever kept. I sat with those 3 clippings side by side a long time. The same sentence effectively repeated across 40 years by 3 different men who almost certainly never once discussed the road with each other, each one apparently arriving independently at the same specific, unfulfilled promise. I want to be honest about what that year of research actually did to me, beyond the facts themselves. I stopped sleeping well most nights, on or off shift, and I found myself, more than once, sitting in my car in the library parking lot for 20 minutes after closing, unable to make myself drive straight home, going back over everything Mrs. Pruitt had shown me until it all blurred together into a single, unbroken 60-year thread I couldn't stop pulling on. A partner I was seeing at the time told me, gently, that I seemed like I was somewhere else most evenings, and she wasn't wrong. I didn't tell her why. I don't think I fully had the words for why, even to myself, until much later. That relationship ended, quietly and without much drama, about a year before everything with Cody Marsh happened, and I've never been entirely sure how much of that ending belonged to mile marker 12 and how much simply belonged to 2 people growing apart the ordinary way. I suspect it was more of the former than I let myself believe at the time. She was right. 5 separate infrastructure proposals across nearly 60 years, each one recommending curve realignment or guardrail upgrades at that exact location, each one appearing in preliminary budget documents before disappearing from final approved budgets with no recorded explanation, across 5 different county administrations that otherwise had little in common politically or philosophically. I asked her whether that kind of consistent, unexplained defunding was unusual. She said county infrastructure budgets got cut and reshuffled constantly for all kinds of ordinary political reasons, and that she wouldn't read too much into it. She said this, I noticed, without once looking up from the desk. That piece stayed with me the rest of that year, and it was what finally made me ask our shift supervisor, Renata Cole, directly, whether she'd ever heard anything about the mile marker 12 pattern in her own 2 decades with the department. I caught her at the end of a shift, both of us tired in the particular way overnight work makes you tired, and asked as plainly as I could manage. She was quiet for a long moment, longer than I'd ever known her to go quiet, her hand resting on the edge of her own console as though bracing against it, before telling me that in her 3rd year on the console, decades before I'd started, she'd taken one of those calls herself, at the very start of her career, and had been so shaken by it that she'd requested a transfer to day's shift the following week. A transfer she'd never once explained to anyone in writing beyond citing a preference for daytime hours. I've heard a lot in this job, she told me, not quite looking at me directly. I've never asked to change my whole schedule over any of it, before or since, except that one time. She never told me exactly what the call had said. I never asked her to. I noticed, though, in all the years I worked under her after that conversation, that she never once assigned herself to a shift that would put her on console during the overnight hours again, not even for a single night's coverage in an emergency, a pattern I genuinely never thought to question before I knew why it existed. Year 6. The last week of that 6th year is the one I still find hardest to put back together in order. By that point, I'd started keeping my private notebook closer to hand during shifts than I ever admitted to Marcus, and I developed, without ever officially logging it anywhere, a habit of double-checking caller ID fields the instant any call came in referencing that stretch of road, a small private ritual that had by then become as automatic as anything else in the job. I told Marcus, finally, everything I'd learned from Mrs. Pruitt, including the part about the calls clustering around whoever paid the closest attention. He listened without interrupting, the same steady patience he brought to every panicked caller he'd ever talked down, and when I finished he told me, quietly, that he thought I should request a transfer off overnight shift, the same way Renata Cole had, decades earlier, without ever fully explaining why to anyone. I told him I wasn't ready to yet. I've thought about that conversation more than almost any other since, because I think some part of me already knew, sitting in that windowless room with him, that whatever was going to happen next was going to happen soon, and that some other part of me had decided, without ever quite admitting it out loud, that I wanted to be there when it did. It started with an actual emergency, the kind our system was built for, a genuine single-vehicle accident at mile marker 12. A real teenage driver, 17 years old, named Cody Marsh, who'd lost control on the curve during a rainstorm and gone into the ditch alongside the road. His girlfriend, riding with him, called it in herself, hysterical but entirely real, describing an actual scene that Deputy Hollis confirmed the moment he arrived. A real wrecked car, a real injured driver, exactly matching every detail she gave. I remember the specific relief of that call being exactly what it presented itself as, nothing more, a real emergency with a real, if frightening, outcome, Cody conscious and talking when the ambulance arrived. I noted his age reflexively as I typed the incident report, the way I noted every detail on every call, and it wasn't until several minutes later, in a lull after the ambulance had cleared, that the number actually registered, 17. The same age Dana Ferris had been the night of her own accident on that same stretch of road, years before. I told myself it meant nothing at all, that plenty of accidents on that curve had involved teenage drivers over the decades, that a coincidence of age wasn't a pattern. I've never been entirely able to make myself believe that, not even in the moment I was telling it to myself. Cody Marsh recovered fully from his injuries within a few months, according to the follow-up notes in his file, and as far as I know he still lives in the county today, presumably with no idea any of this was ever connected to him at all. I learned, secondhand, through Deputy Hollis, that Cody had told his own mother, in the hospital that same night, that he remembered a moment right before losing control on the wet curve where he'd been certain, with no visual basis for it at all, that someone else was standing in the road directly ahead of him, a detail his mother had relayed to Deputy Hollis mostly as an explanation for her son's evasive steering, not realizing, since she'd never lived through any of the rest of it, exactly what she was describing. What made that night different from an ordinary accident call was what happened roughly 90 minutes later, after Cody had already been extracted and transported by ambulance, while Deputy Hollis and his second responding unit were still on scene documenting the wreck. A second call came in from the same general location, same blank caller ID field as before, the young voice again, saying that there were more people trapped, that the first ambulance hadn't found everyone. Near the end of the call, before it cut off, the voice said one more thing, quieter than everything before it, almost gentle. She's been waiting a long time. Please don't make her wait anymore. My hands were already moving before I'd fully registered what I was hearing, the same trained reflex that had carried me through 6 years of this job, even as some other part of me went cold with recognition. Deputy Hollis, still physically standing at the actual accident scene, told me over radio that he could hear nothing at all beyond the real, ordinary sounds of his own scene. But when I relayed to him exactly what the second caller was describing, a specific second vehicle position, a specific number of additional occupants, he walked the ditch line roughly 40 yards further than his initial search had covered, in the exact direction the phantom caller had described, his radio traffic to me, going quieter and more clipped with every step, the way a person's voice does when they're genuinely uncertain what they're about to find. He found a second, older vehicle there, run off the road at some earlier point entirely unrelated to Cody Marsh's accident that night, mostly reclaimed by brush and years of weather. A vehicle registered, according to the plate he ran on scene, to a family that had reported it stolen and never recovered nearly 9 years earlier. Inside, he found the remains of a woman who had never been reported missing by anyone, because, as it turned out weeks later once identification was completed, she'd been reported by her own family at the time as having simply left the state on her own, following a period of personal difficulty nobody in her life had ever fully understood or followed up on. I remember sitting at my console during those minutes with my hand pressed flat against the desk, the way you brace yourself for news you already half know is coming, listening to Deputy Hollis's radio traffic go from routine search chatter to the specific, careful terminology officers switch into the moment a search stops being a search and becomes a recovery. I logged every transmission exactly as protocol required, my voice level, my hands steady on the keyboard, and it wasn't until my shift ended 2 hours later that I sat in my car in the station parking lot and let myself shake for a while before I felt able to drive home. Deputy Hollis's voice on the radio when he found her was the steadiest I'd ever heard from him at an actual scene, the particular flat calm of a person holding themselves together through pure discipline rather than any absence of feeling. He requested additional units and the medical examiner in the same measured tone he used for any other call, and it wasn't until nearly an hour later, back at the station finishing his report, that he told me quietly, off radio, that the second caller's voice, the one that had led him to that exact spot, had, for one single sentence near the very end of the call, sounded, in his own words, almost relieved, the way a person sounds when something they've been carrying alone for a long time is finally about to be set down. The department's official case file on that discovery, closed several months later, listed the cause as an unrelated single-vehicle accident from years prior, unconnected to Cody Marsh's crash except by proximity, the second call attributed to an unidentified witness, possibly a passerby who did not remain on scene. A real, defensible, official explanation, and one that requires believing an anonymous passerby happened to call in a body that had been undiscovered for 9 years, from a blank number our system had never once otherwise produced, in language matching exactly the pattern I'd been logging privately for years by that point. I have never once fully believed it, and I don't think Deputy Hollis has either, though neither of us has ever said so to anyone in an official capacity. I learned, weeks later, through a colleague who handled victim notification, that the woman's name was Karen Aldis, 41 years old at the time she'd gone missing, and that her family had spent 9 years believing she'd simply chosen to disappear from their lives, a belief that had, according to the notification officer, quietly poisoned nearly every relationship in that family in the years since. A sister who'd stopped speaking to their mother over disagreements about whether to keep looking, a father who'd died 2 years earlier still convinced she'd call eventually if they just waited long enough. Karen's sister, according to the same notification officer, said only one thing when she was finally given the news, delivered flat and exhausted after 9 years of not knowing. I always told them she wouldn't have just left without saying goodbye. I think about that family more than I let on to anyone who asks about this story. 9 years of a wrong story, corrected only because something on that road apparently refused to let it stay wrong forever. I gave my notice within the month. I told my supervisor it was simply time for a change, which was true in the narrow, technical way. Surface explanations are always true without being the whole truth, and I transferred to a dispatch position in a different county entirely the following season, a county with flat, straight highways and, as far as I've ever been able to determine, no single stretch of road that anyone on staff treats differently from any other. Deputy Hollis was the one who drove me to the airport, my last week in that county, both of us mostly quiet for the first half of the drive. Somewhere past the county line, he told me he thought I'd done the right thing leaving, and that he wished, some days, he had a job that let him do the same. He'd worked patrol in that district for nearly 15 years by then, most of his adult life, and I understood, without either of us saying it directly, that mile marker 12 wasn't a place he could simply transfer away from the way I could, since patrol coverage doesn't work that way, since somebody has to keep driving that stretch of road regardless of what either of us privately believed about it. He shook my hand at the departure gate, an oddly formal gesture after everything we'd been through together, and told me to take care of myself, in a tone that made clear he meant it in a much fuller sense than the words usually carry. I stayed in touch with Marcus for a couple of years after I left. About 2 years after, he told me the county had finally, quietly approved and completed the guardrail and curve realignment project at mile marker 12 that had failed to get funded for nearly 60 straight years, following, he said carefully, an unrelated but sufficiently severe accident the year after I'd left that had finally generated enough political pressure to override whatever had been blocking it for 6 decades. He described the construction crew's work to me in more detail than I expected, unprompted, the way people do when something stayed with them longer than they meant it to. The foreman had told Marcus, weeks after the project wrapped, that his crew had logged an unusual number of equipment malfunctions specifically during the 2 weeks they worked directly on the curve itself, malfunctions that stopped entirely, without any repair or explanation, the moment that section of the project was finished and the crew moved further down the road. He told me the mile marker 12 calls had stopped entirely in the 2 years since the realignment was completed, not slowed down, not become less frequent, simply stopped, as completely and abruptly as they'd started decades earlier, for reasons nobody at the department has ever been able to explain any better than they could explain why the calls had happened in the first place. Marcus told me the old wooden crosses at the curve had disappeared sometime during the construction, cleared along with the rest of the roadside brush, and that nobody, as far as he knew, had ever thought to ask the construction crew whether they'd noticed them before removing them. I asked him, on that same call, whether he'd ever kept his own private notebook the way I had, all those years working that console before me. He was quiet for a moment, then told me he had, tucked away somewhere he'd never shown anyone, and that he had no plans to ever look at it again now that the calls had stopped, the same way I've never once opened mine since the day I left that job. I tried, once more, a few years after I'd left, to reach Dana Ferris's aunt, this time by letter rather than phone, since I thought a letter might feel less intrusive than a stranger's voice on the line. I wrote as plainly and honestly as I could manage, explaining who I was, explaining that the road was fixed now and the calls had stopped, though I left out most of the specifics, unsure how much any of it would help her rather than simply reopen something she'd asked me, years earlier, to leave alone. She never wrote back. I don't blame her for that, and some part of me is glad she didn't, since I've never been fully sure what I would have said if she had. I still think about that stretch of road more often than I'd like to admit, even now, years removed from that console. I still, in the county I work in now, find myself listening a little more carefully than strictly necessary whenever a caller's voice sounds young and frightened and the caller ID field comes back anything less than completely, unambiguously normal. I have never once, in the years since, dismissed a blank caller ID as a simple system error without checking it twice. I still, without ever quite deciding to, Keep a small notebook in my bag at every job I've worked since, empty pages so far, and I've never been able to fully explain to a coworker why I carry it, only that it feels safer than not having one, in case I ever need it again. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a person who's carried something like this for years without saying it out loud. It isn't fear, exactly, not most nights. It's closer to a permanent, low-grade attentiveness, the sense that the ordinary world has one fewer clean edge in it than you used to believe it had, and that you've simply learned to work alongside that missing edge the way you'd work alongside an old injury that aches before rain. I don't think about mile marker 12 every shift anymore. But I have never once, since leaving that job, fully returned to the version of myself who assumed every impossible detail on a call had a technical explanation waiting to be found, if I was just patient enough to look for it. I've worked 2 consoles since, in 2 different counties, and in each one, within the first few months, I found myself quietly checking whether any stretch of local road carries a reputation the staff don't discuss openly, half expecting, every time, to find nothing, and feeling something close to relief every single time I don't. Every so often, usually on a long overnight shift when the console goes quiet for a stretch, I find myself running the whole thing back in order. The flat, terse voice from my first year, the disconnected numbers, the scanner with no power source, Dana Ferris saying the exact same line at 15 that she'd say again as a ghost at 17, the timestamp that arrived before the call that produced it, the tally marks on 2 different crosses at the edge of a curve, Renata Cole's hand bracing. On her own console, Priya hanging up a call against every rule she'd ever been trained on. Deputy Hollis pulling his sleeve down over a scar nobody should have known about. A family who spent 9 years believing a wrong story that something on that road refused to let stand. And I try, every time, to find the one detail that breaks the pattern. The one piece that would let all of it collapse back into coincidence and bad equipment and the ordinary chaos of a stressful job. I have never once found it. 7 years of my life, most of them spent doing work I was genuinely proud of, and one stretch of road that I still, to this day, cannot hear a caller mention without something in my chest going quiet and careful, the way you'd go quiet and careful walking past a door you already know better than to knock on. If you spend enough years listening to strangers at the worst moment of their lives through a thin piece of plastic against your ear, you learn that most of what sounds impossible over a phone line has a mundane explanation waiting underneath it, if you're patient enough to find it: bad equipment, human error, the ordinary chaos of people in crisis describing things imperfectly. I used to believe that completely, without exception. I still mostly do, in every county I've worked since, except for one stretch of road I no longer dispatch anyone toward, where, for nearly 60 years, the same request kept finding its way onto a phone line that shouldn't have been able to carry it at all. Please send someone. As far as I know, nobody's had to anymore. I hope, more than almost anything else from that job, that it stays that way.